Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming. It's really nice to see you in person on such a beautiful day outside. It feels like spring. We can feel it. And it's good to celebrate the upcoming spring with all of you guys today. Very excited for the talk today. The sound sounds better now. Okay. So here we are. Before we introduce Austin Frerick to you, I will just do the usual introductions of our sponsors and the team. So bear with me for 1 second. It's Food Literacy for All. It's co-led by myself, Bénédicte Boisseron, and Shiloh Maples, our community organizer and co-instructor. Community partners that make this course possible is Jerry Ann Hebron from the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, Winona Bingham, Detroit Food Policy Council, and Shakara Tyler, the Detroit Black Community Food Sovereignty Network. There are more team members here that make this course possible and help with the course. And Sammy from Food Literacy for All course coordinator right here. Taylor next to Sammy, our graduate student instructor. Sai, Sustainable Food Systems Initiative coordinator. Dr. Leslie Hoy here with us today. Chris Taylor, our tech, right here as well to my right, and Tiffany Harris of Food Literacy for All Grader right here. Thank you, Tiffany. Food Literacy for All is presented by with the generous support from the Center for the Education of Women, Francis and Sidney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, the School for the Environment and Sustainability, SEAS, and the Program in the Environment, also known as PITE. For engagement, we are on Instagram and X, and the poll questions are on iClickers for students and online YouTube for our community members. And all classes are filmed and available on the SFSI website. For today, our student response is by Tanvi Malia. I hope I pronounced it well. Tanvi, are you here? Maybe. Yes? The pronunciation okay? Okay. And she's a senior at public health.
Chapter 2, The Grain Barons. Imagine you're playing Monopoly. You start with a few properties, but as the game goes on, one player buys up everything. Soon, they control the board, making it nearly impossible for anyone else to win. Frustrating, right? Well, that's exactly what happened in the grain industry, and Cargill is the ultimate Monopoly player. Founded in 1865, Cargill started as a small grain storage business, but its vision of an endless belt led them to become one of the most powerful private corporations in modern history. They took advantage of new land policies and economic crises and quickly became the leader in commodity crops. Today, it floods grocery stores with its products, like high fructose corn syrup, which have reshaped the American diet and fueled rising obesity and diabetes rates. Yet instead of taking responsibility, Cargill profits from reshaping our diets while deflecting blame on the public health crisis they helped create. Frerick argues that breaking up these monopolies is essential to creating a fair, more resilient food system. Otherwise, just like in Monopoly, when one player owns everything, no one else stands a chance. Without serious action, Cargill's dominance will continue shaping the policies that govern our food system, how much we pay, and what we eat.
Thank you, Tanvi, for this great video response. Thank you very much for that. Now we'll call on Shiloh to do the introduction for our speaker for today.
Good evening. Can you hear me all right? Great. So this evening, I have the pleasure of welcoming Austin Frerick to our course. Austin Frerick is an expert on agricultural and antitrust policy. He worked at the Open Markets Institute, the U.S. Department of Treasury, and the Congressional Research Service before becoming a fellow at Yale University. He is a seventh-generation Iowan and first-generation college graduate with degrees from Grinnell College and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tonight, Austin is offering a talk on his book, Barons, Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry.
Chapter 2.
In some ways, the topic of corruption seems counter to the theme of this year's course, food and care. However, the planning team last fall agreed it was important to share examples of what happens when the love of money and power outweighs the care of people and planet. Austin's book does this by telling the story of 7 titans of the food industry, their rise to power, and the consequences for workers, eaters, and democracy itself. It paints a stark portrait of corporate consolidation, but it also shows that a fair, healthy, and prosperous food industry is possible if we take back power from the barons who have robbed us of it. So without further ado, please join me in offering a warm welcome to tonight's speaker, Austin Frerick.
Thank you, Shailen.
And at this time, I'd also welcome up Taylor to work with Austin with the iClicker questions for this evening.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, Austin, I know that you were strategic with these questions, so maybe we'll move over to that part of our presentation today. And if you want to maybe introduce the question or give some context as to why you chose these, and I will run the poll for the students.
Okay. So just so you know, the way I think of this is, so for every baron in my book, I thought of 3 factoids for each one to kind of display their power. So it's kind of, it's easy to sit there and say they do X amount of volume, but making tangible examples really helps hone the point. So that's where this stat comes from, is I can tell you how many gallons of milk they produce, but if I do school milk cartons, because everyone can conceptualize a school milk carton, it really shows how big their operation is.
And just to clarify, this poll is particularly designed for students in the class, and this is how we gauge their participation. So if you're a community member joining us, I just encourage you to think about these questions.
And for anyone from Indiana or Chicago, my dairy baron is Fair Oaks Farms. It's on that stretch of interstate between Chicago and Indianapolis.
Great. So, Austin, you can see the distribution here of students' answers.
Oh, fascinating. Am I allowed to say it?
Yeah, go for it.
So the most popular answer is C, 400,000 school milk cartons a day by my dairy baron. Can I say the correct answer?
Let's go for it.
All right, it's D. One dairy operation does 4 million school milk cartons a day. Part of the reason why the operation's on the interstate is that's so much milk. It would just tear apart gravel roads. But that's 35,000 cows doing 4 million milk cartons a day of milk.
All right, question 2.
Mm-hmm. This one's wild. So I tend to think I know a lot about the meat industry. This news was announced right before the 2020 election and was lost. So I'm not talking about campaign contributions. I'm talking about they pled guilty to giving legit bribes, including a New York City Manhattan apartment. So what's your guess on how many politicians they pled guilty to bribing? And for context too, this was all in Brazil. They bribed politicians in Brazil to get cheap money to then buy a bunch of companies, including companies in America. Yeah, so half the people voted for C, 829 politicians. The correct answer is 1,829 politicians that they pled guilty to.
All right, question 3.
What percent of Walmart sales are from groceries? Now I have to tell you, this was really fun pulling these questions together for you guys. I kind of joke that these are like my cocktail little tricks. I mean, you don't usually talk about Walmart market share or that, but everyone has a certain opinion of Walmart. Actually, this one's more even. Mm-hmm. So we have about a third of the people saying it's B and a third saying D. It's D. I have every answer is D. That's wild. So to be honest with you, I originally didn't plan to write about Walmart. I just feel like a lot of writing on Walmart's pretty cliche and classist. I actually plan to do Publix. It's like a Florida grocery store as my grocery baron. But when you look at the grocery numbers, there's Walmart and there's everyone else. Walmart sells 1 in 3 groceries in America. That's the same market share as the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th combined. And so here's the thing. On top of it, 60% of the sales is Walmart. It's to get you in the door. Okay? All right, let's dive in. So, as mentioned earlier, my book profiles 7 robber barons, but think of these barons as narrative devices to tell bigger structural stories. Think of it as I'm kind of hiding the vegetable. So as you guys read the grain baron chapter today, my cargo one, that's really my farm bill chapter. Because what I realized putting this book together was, in college you're taught thesis, evidence, evidence. We're emotional creatures. We need story. So how do I wrap a story, a punchy narrative, around a structural story I'm trying to tell you? And I also laid out my book I didn't want to tell the same rich person story over and over. So like one chapter, I kind of view my hog baron as almost my trashy Florida money baron. And then, like, my grain baron is like almost my waspy Connecticut chapter. Is you want to mix up the narrative so it's not the same story over and over. Yeah. Oh. Is this one working? Okay, my bad. So I always like to start with this graph. And I realized in the back of people's heads when I first started doing this was, I'm asking you to pay more for food. Because industry continually says this system makes cheap food. Check this out. This is from USDA data, brand new. So take a look at the right. That's what the average American spends on groceries, $3,694. That's more than a lot of other Western democracies. Here's the thing, though, and this is a really good example, this is the nerd in me, of how one data set can tell two stories. So what industry tends to do is it focuses on that 6.8%. That's percent of income. But if they're smart, they'll say, well, we spend the least amount of food of our income. That's factually true. Here's the thing. There's something in economics called the Gini coefficient. It's a ratio between the have-not. We have one of the highest in the world. You can't use, so much of the income growth in America has been captured by the top. What matters to the bottom half of Americans is that $3,694. And we shouldn't be shocked, though. Concentrated markets gouge. Never forget the goal of any MBA student is monopoly. You don't want competitive markets. You want monopoly. You want concentration because that way you can gouge. I mean, take a look at this Bloomberg Law piece from 3 years ago. It was a classic story. It was right before Thanksgiving where every protein in America, including salmon and tuna, were under investigation for price fixing except turkey. Because here's the thing, if there's only a few players in the game, it's really easy to act like a cartel. And then guess what? Right after Thanksgiving, turkey was under investigation for price fixing. And the scary thing, too, is it used to be you'd get a hotel room and like collude. Now there's all these quasi-legal data brokers where all these companies essentially share their information, they aggregate it, and then you can collude that way without overtly colluding in a room. It's actually happening right now in apartment complexes. We'll get to that in a second. But the other thing is, even when we talk about food, we tend to talk about these markets in a national context, but food is local. You're not going to take milk from Maine and sell it in New Mexico. So like I asked a dairy guy I know in Wisconsin a year or two ago to do a paper on this, where one company in New England has an 85% market share of milk. And I don't need a PhD in economics to know these people aren't paying a fair price for milk. And then here's a good, so you know they say there's that phrase, a picture will say 1,000 words? This is the nerd version. This is cattle prices. So the red line is what the rancher received for their cattle, and the blue line is what you paid in the store. See this divergence right here? This is basically highly correlated. That's a good market, and then you just see it break. And then check out COVID, where what the cattle ranchers was getting low, and you just see this surge. The reason why the markets have tightened a little bit, I am told by my ranching friends, is the dry spell right now in the West. Basically, because of the climate crisis, the cattle herd in America is collapsing because a lot of these production regions in America can't handle this intensity. So you're seeing a little tightening of that market, but this is like Monopoly 101, like textbook monopoly behavior right here. And the best example, too, is so McDonald's, unbeknownst to most people, McDonald's is the largest buyer of beef in the world. And in most businesses, you tend to treat your largest customer the best way possible. McDonald's filed lawsuits this fall saying the beef packers are engaged in price fixing. So it's not something when even McDonald's feels like it's being shortchanged. And finally, I want to flag this piece written by a fellow Iowan, Kate Conlow. What I realized writing this chapter is, to be blunt, every commodity in America has their go-to corrupt academic. There's a certain academic, everyone in these markets will say, this person's always kind of they do the bidding of the companies. And I put this in context, and this is my Iowa-ness showing, is as we privatize our universities, private dollars fill that void. Increasingly, you get tenure based on how much money you bring in. So like, for example, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, Iowa has the second highest cancer rate in America, and it's getting worse. But there's very little scholarship in Iowa about the cancer crisis. There's a lot more scholarship saying how do we pack more piggies into a metal shed. And this piece I love because I don't know if you've ever seen that documentary called Inside Job. It's about how the financial crisis happened. And one of the things they discovered were a lot of the literature justifying deregulation was financed by the banks. So in response, a lot of economic journals required disclosure policies. Hey, if you're going to write, if Bank of America is going to pay for this research, just tell me. What Kate discovered is ag economics, there's rampant little enforcement disclosure policies. What she documented is literally this academic at the University of Arizona brags about on his website how much corporate money he's taking. He's an editor of a journal. He doesn't enforce his own disclosure policies, and he's the person on NPR telling you you're not being gouged by the grocery stores, even though he's taking money from Kroger. This is so rampant, and it's scary. It really corrupts the public discourse on this, and I think this is an underappreciated thing that needs to be highlighted more in this space. It's even a lot of the information we're used to have these conversations is tainted. And finally, this is something I kind of realized in the last few years, is the system makes just bad tasting food. The New York Times recently rated Kerrygold, the Irish butter, the #1 butter in the world, and here's the thing, that's just the way we used to do butter in America, cows on pasture. Most cows in America now live in metal sheds. Especially meat and dairy, inputs matter. And so the system is not only paying more, but we're also getting a lower quality product, which, by the way, that's textbook monopoly. So this is the Baron that started this whole book. It literally was in a bar conversation in Des Moines, Iowa, where I didn't know at the time, this is 2018, Iowa doesn't have campaign contribution limits. So this hog farmer, Jeff and Deb Hansen, had given the governor of Iowa over $300,000. Not only that, this person was telling me they had a private jet, they had a home in the fancy part of Des Moines, home in Naples, Florida, and they would fly back and forth between the two on their jet with the words, allegedly, when pigs fly. First of all, that's good copy. Second, what a powerful symbol. For me, what happened to Iowa in my lifetime? I used to see animals driving in Iowa, now I don't. I smell them, but I don't see them. So I originally wrote an article with a buddy, Charlie Mitchell, who's a journalist. How did this happen? Which, keep in mind, look at this photo. This is what a modern day hog production is in America. It's a metal shed. All of them have dumpsters next to them because usually about 10% of the pigs die inside these facilities. So it used to be an independent job. Someone used to be a family farmer, doing their own operation, is now a low-wage worker for this entity. And so there's a whole conversation too to be had over the dignity of work and what the trauma the person now feels dealing with dead animals all day. And here's some more photos. So this is my hog baron's farm, his headquarters. It's in suburban Des Moines. I think an undercurrent in my book too is who is a farmer. My farmer cosplays as a farmer, but are you a farmer if your headquarters looks like a suburban dentist clinic? And then look at his operation, one of his operations in the top left corner. To me, that looks like the New Jersey Turnpike. It's so dead, so industrial. That should be the Tuscany of North America. I would say it's some of the best soil, but the landscape is so dead. But here's the thing, his whole operation is in Iowa. He's in 2/3 of the counties. I kind of joked to someone a few months ago that I kind of blame chicken fingers for everything. Here's the thing, we wrote regulations a century ago in response to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. We didn't write chicken to the regulation. Because you just had a chicken in your backyard, you killed it. So what happened was down south, corporations took that exploitive model to black farmers on sharecropping and applied it to chicken production. It's an incredibly exploitive system, very ripe for labor abuses, but here's the thing. Chickens are gaining a lot of market share because it's engaging in an exploitive system. USDA could have stepped in and be like, chicken, behave like the other meats, but they didn't. They allowed a race to the bottom. So they call this chickenization. It's like the hog industry chickenized. It first chickenized North Carolina and the Eastern Shore and the poor black areas, which to me is one of the best modern days examples of structural racism. But they do these massive hog production things, and a state senator wrote it. He exploited his own loopholes. And in Iowa, at least with these hog facilities, they inject the manure into the lagoons. In North Carolina, they spray into the air because the water tables are too high. So you see these stories of poor black churches having to repaint their steeples every few years. But Iowa, I discovered in my research in the 90s was the state saw North Carolina gain a lot of market share. And again, USDA could have stepped in and be like, no, North Carolina, you can't do hogs this way. But USDA allowed a race to the bottom. So the business elite commissioned a study by DC consultant, how do we maintain our number one status? Because we want to sell as much corn seed and butcher's meat hog seed as possible. And this study said, let's forego the family farm. Let's engage in this race to the bottom. Let's engage in this deregulatory nature to maintain our number one status. And so what you had happen was actually true rural rebellion. You had small towns where you had 2,000 or 3,000 people show up, promise, wanting something. Because keep in mind, imagine living next to one of these. They're manure factories. A hog defecates 3 times more than a human. And to put it in context, Iowa's 25 million hogs. That's the same manure as 75 million people. That's California, Texas, and Illinois combined with a regulatory system that's been gutted. So you see people's home values collapse. I mean, I tell this story like Pat Buchanan. He's like a famous old-time right-leaning politician, famously opposed confinements in Iowa. And people credit his second-place victory in 1992 to his opposition. And so what you see here is you just see the hog family farm crater as the industrial model takes hold. What tends to happen, you saw this just happen in dairy a few years ago, is that Wall Street capital floods the market. There's an overproduction, there's a glut. Entities with large access to cheap capital can survive the glut, and then the family farm goes bankrupt, or they exit the market. There's a whole mental health thing here where people blame themselves for failing, not realizing you're designed to fail. You're not competing on a price. Because here's the thing. The second you regulate industrial hog manure like human manure, that model is no longer economically viable. No city would handle manure like the way these facilities handle manure. So the consequences of this model is 2/3 of the waterways in Iowa are just too polluted to go into. I view the lake streams and ponds of Iowa as open sewers at this point. Iowa is a canary in the coal mine for the American food system. As I mentioned earlier, second highest cancer rate, obesity crisis, and a water crisis in a place that should be the Tuscany. And I think knowing that's how I approached this, is I saw it all fall apart in my lifetime. So Cargill. Again, Cargill is one too I didn't plan to write about. Cargill's like this, if you grew up in the Midwest, you kind of see it, but you don't really know what it is. Let me read you this from one of their brochures. And I know you guys read this chapter today, but I just love this quote. We are the flour in your bread, the wheat in your noodles, the salt on your fries. We are the corn in your tortillas, the chocolate in your dessert, the sweetener in your soft drinks. We are the oil in your salad dressing, and the beef, pork, or chicken you eat for dinner. We are the cotton in your clothing, the backing on your carpet, and the fertilizer in your field. First of all, again, that's beautiful prose. That is power. And I should say, there's a retired farm activist in Canada that went through their pamphlets and discovered that. I think of Cargill as the closest modern day example to Standard Oil. They're all about the movement of grains. They basically, when the grain gets harvested to when it's processed, they own that part. They move 1 in 3, 1 in 4 grains globally. Again, going to my obsession over putting things in context, their size is equal to the state tax revenue of all these states you see in green. They're the largest private company in America. They're bigger than the Kochs. And as I mentioned earlier too, I used their story to tell the story of the Farm Bill. What's funny? I was telling someone earlier, I think a hallmark of this moment we're living in time is so much language is designed to keep people out. And I say that I think it's because I'm a first-generation college student. I'm very conscious of that. And you realize a lot of Farm Bill programs are like that. Like crop insurance. Crop insurance took me forever to understand. You start using these terms, and it sounds like it's for thunderstorms. It's none of that. The modern-day crop insurance in America is basically insurance for low prices, where 60 to 70% of the premium is paid for by American taxpayers. So it's just imagine and there's also no cap on it. So Bill Gates is actually one of the largest owners of farmland in America, and it only applies to certain crops. So Bill Gates can get as much insurance as he wants for low prices to grow corn. And so here's the thing, it pushes that system to do that. But to step back for a second, I think of the original Farm Bill is actually like Goldilocks. Keep in mind, so everyone thinks of the 1920s as the Roaring '20s, the flappers, that kind of thing. It was actually a point of depression for most of rural America. These markets were glutted. And what happens when markets are glutted, people tend to push their land and engage in destructive environmental practices because they're just trying to get by. So these markets were glutted, and so the new Farm Bill comes along and basically tries to do a Goldilocks thing where you'll get some subsidy, but you have to take stuff out of production. You have to take land out of production, and you can only get so much. So it's trying to figure out a sweet spot for production where how do you produce enough but not too much? What happened was the Cargill family hated this because they want to move and process as much grain as possible. So anything that attempts to limit production, they hate. They thought I had to read all 1,500 pages of their commission family history. It was awful, but they thought FDR was evil. Marxist, yada, yada. They thought about leaving America. But it turns out well-regulated markets are actually good for business. So it was really during the New Deals when they transitioned from a regional player to a national player. But from there, they kept trying to undermine the Farm Bill. And I focused on the 1996 Farm Bill as the one that went off the rails, where now the Farm Bill is designed to overproduce grains at the expense of everything else. That's where you really get the crop insurance thing, where how do we get you to grow as much corn as possible? Corn and soy. Whereas you grow carrots, you get nothing. So I mean, a dark joke is the farmer you see at the farmer's market is honestly the only farmer really in the free market because they get no subsidy. Here's the thing. I don't want to blame farmers in this system because here's the thing. If you want to farm, you have to basically engage in this system. If you want to do hogs right now in America, you essentially have to do this industrial system. The other thing too is, and I realized this just talking to a banker in Western Iowa, was growing up in Iowa, you see all these silos. And I've noticed in my lifetime, they either have collapsed or they're all in disarray. And I was like, hey, Liz, what's going on here? What she told me is, the beauty of the family farm, it's almost like a diversified retirement portfolio. You have 5 or 6 crops, so in case one craters, you're still fine. What this system does is it makes you do 1 or 2 things. So it really pushes you to do corn or soy or hogs. So it used to be you grow your own grain for your own animals. That system's gone. You grow grain, you sell it to Cargill, and they sell it to the other person who does hogs. So it actually makes a system, it makes it fragile. And I think that's an underappreciated thing of this moment. The other thing too is, this to me is the best stat to show you how broken this system is. This is for every dollar you spend in the store, this is what a farmer gets. We see after I'm going to keep calling it the Goldilocks Farm Bill, half of every dollar went back to the farmer. And now we're at all-time low, about like 11 cents. So just imagine the state of rural America if it was back at that 50 cents on the dollar went back to these communities. I privately view, I shouldn't say privately because I'm telling you right now, but I kind of view a lot of rural America now as almost extraction colonies in America. The land's producing the most wealth it's ever produced, but none of that wealth is staying there. So the politics of anger are filling that void. And I rely on Julie Guthman at the University of Santa Cruz, who's done a lot of scholarship here, but so much of the obesity crisis in America is rooted in this overproduction of grains, where now you essentially need money to eat healthy in this country. And this is a good example too of that fragility of the family farm system. You see that a lot of family farms used to have multiple crops, and now essentially you just do 1 or 2 things. So JB. So this is like one of my favorite slides to show people because it's like one of my little shock and awe slides. So before I show you this slide, keep in mind this company, Secret German Family, did not sell a single bean of coffee in America until 2012. They threw a bunch of capital and they bought all these brands. They now sell more coffee than Starbucks. Here's all the brands this one Secret Germany family owns. In business terms, they call this a roll-up strategy. They saw a competitive market. They threw their capital at it to get a dominant market position. So it used to be what you see is this is an illusion of choice. And also when they bought, those little Keurig cups? When they bought the Keurig cups, they got all these brands too. That's why if you go to Krispy Kreme now, you'll see like a Dr. Pepper Krispy Kreme. Cross promotions. But here's the thing, they're actually engaging in this play again. They're rolling out vet clinics. This sounds awful to say, but during the COVID crisis, they realized people are irrational economically with their animals when they're sick. So that was their current monopoly play. But I use this chapter to tell the story of the history of anti-monopoly law in America, or what some people call antitrust. It's rooted in this man named Louis Brandeis. Actually, fun fact, the first anti-monopoly laws in the world come out of Iowa. There are Iowa farmers mad about the grain elevators. But Louis Brandeis really ushered in this first framework of anti-monopoly laws in America, where, to be frank, most companies don't buy another company for pro-competitive reasons. So he made it really hard for that to happen. Just a few decades ago, what this German family did, this rolling up an industry would not have been possible. What happened is, fast forward to Robert Bork, famously known as Nixon Hatchet Man. This man agreed to essentially ignore the US Constitution and do Nixon's bidding because he was promised a Supreme Court seat. His whole intellectual scholarship was basically pro-monopoly. They call it the consumer welfare standard, where if I'm a company and I buy another company, if I can show that if I can hire an economist who said prices go down for consumers, my merger will be approved. Well, guess what? I can find any economist produce those numbers. Again, people like him are a tale as old as time. You're always going to have academics do the bidding of the rich. I personally think his scholarship shouldn't be trusted, given that we found out later in the Nixon tapes he engaged in illegal constitutional behavior. But what's really fascinating to me, one of the most hopeful things of this moment, is President Biden appointed this young woman named Lena Khan to chair the Federal Trade Commission. And her whole thing was she wants to return to the Lewis Brandeis antitrust framework. She wrote an academic article about how Amazon's monopoly that went viral 5 years ago. There was a profile was written on her, and then President Biden appointed her. She's the one bringing all those antitrust cases against big tech. She just got a big case victory against Google for being a monopoly, and the Trump administration agreed to then talk about breaking up Google right now. You're seeing the politics here being really interesting and fascinating and weird. Vice President Vance has praised her. And even for what I saw in Iowa last summer was she did an event on fertilizer consolidation, and she had 100 people show up, including like a lovely old woman I know in Ames, Iowa, brought a copy of her article to sign. First of all, no bureaucrat in DC gets 100 people at a talk, especially in a small town in Iowa, but she did. I think people really crave a sense of a public servant being a public servant and also standing up to power and winning. And also, it just goes to show you how bipartisan this stuff is right now, because everyone's seeing the system not work. And she also helped stop the Kroger-Albertson merger. So all these brands you see right here would have been one company. And what's fascinating is under oath, even the executives they admitted, in small towns where they tend to have a dominant market position, they were charging people higher prices. So think of it, the communities producing our food are actually paying the most for the food. And finally, a really big point of this chapter, and this is the hardest chapter to write, because I'm talking about Panera, then I'm talking about Germans, is after World War II, Congress commissioned a report, how did this happen? And one of their biggest findings were monopolists financed fascists. Hitler's largest donor was a company called IG Farben. Hitler would walk into the room, I don't mean those crazy things, let me help you sell product. This report said, quote, that donation made the dreams of my company come true. After the war, the American military broke these companies up. IG Farben was broken up into 7 companies. You might have heard of one of them today. It's called Bayer Monsanto. But there's a really good book called Hell's Cartel on this history, how monopolists finance fascists. And finally, right before I went to press, the Wall Street Journal reported that my coffee baron still sells coffee in Russia. And keep in mind, this family, I should say too, has a dark German past. It was uncovered in the British tabloids that not only were they Hitler supporters, they were very early Nazi supporters. The father engaged in slave labor. It gets really messy. He had an affair with one of the workers, had children with her, and now some of those children now kind of own this company. So this history came out, the family made a donation, atoned for their sins. And then once I saw this story, I was like, oh, your words mean nothing. I think Putin is the closest modern day example we have to a fascist in the world. So Fair Life is the other chapter you read. So this was a hard one to write because I was determined to teach you about checkoffs. I think checkoffs control the conversation over the American food system. And also, so this is what their product is. It's doing blockbuster numbers. Young men are obsessed with protein right now, and they love their core power. You go to any Planet Fitness in America, you'll see tons of core power. So, as I mentioned earlier, their operations in that stretch of interstate between the two cities. What's fascinating is I'm a big believer in you can research something, but sometimes you just gotta see things and talk to people. And I was driving around their operation, and I kept seeing canals everywhere. And I've seen a lot of cornfields in my lifetime, and I've never seen canals around cornfields. So it's like, what's going on here? Turns out this was known as Everglades of the North. Lake Michigan historically used to overflow into this area. Like Teddy Roosevelt used to go hunting here. So first of all, you shouldn't even, I told you that hogs defecate a lot. Dairy cows defecate an insane amount. It's like 60 to 80 pounds of manure a day. Like his operation, my dairy barons, it's 35,000 cows. Those cows do as much manure in a day as the city of Austin, Texas. And you're doing this on a form of wetlands. Like you shouldn't even be doing row crops here, really, if we're being honest. But here's the thing, he was able to buy 20,000 acres at once because it was supposed to be a third Chicago airport. That just never panned out. And you have to say, like, this is a weird thing to say, but there's aspects of each baron you have to admire from a business standpoint. And for them is, number one, they saw the coming water crisis in the West. What happened in the 80s is a lot of industrial dairies went to the West because you can do these massive industrial feedlots. What happens is the aquifers dried up. So now they're essentially moving back to the Midwest. And he saw that come. So he was one of the first movers of this. But here's the thing, he also saw what happened to Iowa hog farmers, and he was like, I'm not going down like that. That's why he made that fancy milk. That fancy milk was tested in Texas for 10 years. If anyone's from Texas here, he tested at HAB. So like, I like Fairlife, I'm not gonna lie, but that thing was engineered to be good. You can actually tour his facility, because his whole thing was his whole notion is get ahead of the narrative. So you can tour it, literally it's a California bus. I've been in this little bus. It is part of a massive tourist complex he built. There's an ice cream shop. This is like a milk carton rock climbing wall. You can't see it, but they just built a Marriott-themed dairy hotel next to it. I don't know if I mentioned this. It's one of the largest tourist attractions in the state of Indiana. You board your little buses right here. You can go to a hog confinement. You can tour a dairy confinement. By the way, it's not cheap. It's like $20 a person. And so here's the thing. The checkoff thing I mentioned. Checkoffs are a really good example of the food system with something with a good intention that's went off the rails. They come out of the New Deal. Literally, farmers checked the box and they paid into a pot of money. And it comes out of Florida citrus farmers being like, drink more Florida orange juice. Here's the thing, there's like 20, 25 checkoffs to this day. There's a Christmas tree, there's a popcorn. They're small, they don't matter. They're the things at the fair that hand you a free sample. The meat and dairy ones are a different beast. And it goes back to that Wall Street Farm Bill. Whereas the Farm Bill is designed now to overproduce a few things, how do I get you to eat more of surplus? So now, like the dairy checkoff is the goal is to get you to eat more cheese. On top of it, there's vertical integration. So the largest owner of hogs in America is actually a Chinese company called the WH Group of China, or Shanghai, sorry. But they're also the largest butcher of hogs. You might have heard of them, Smithfield. So the voice of the pork checkoff is actually, one could argue, the voice of a Chinese multinational because of vertical integration. But dairy, we estimate the checkoff dairy program alone is a $600 million pot of money. Here's the thing, I say we estimate. We don't really know. There are so many reports by the Inspector General saying there's so low oversight at USDA of these programs. And just to give you an example of it, Secretary Vilsack, who served under President Obama and then Biden, was an industrial dairy checkoff lobbyist in between, making $1 million a year. This checkoff money finances a revolving door at USDA. It finances all that junk science. And I tell this story, oh yeah, that's why like most of the climate solutions in agriculture are kind of a farce. I mean, come on, ethanol in airplanes. Anyone that thinks ethanol is good for the climate in 2025 thinks the world is flat. I said that joke at Iowa State last fall, and I was really proud of myself for that. I tell this chapter of the checkoff of how, so here's the thing, that milk I showed you, that Fairlife, that's bougie milk. To quote one Coca-Cola executive, it's twice the price of milk for half the volume. So its main competition is generic milk. So my dairy barons hated it. Why pay into a program that's advertising your competition? So they seemingly financed a lawsuit that went all the way up Supreme Court to get out of the checkoff. They didn't. They lost that case. So what I argue is they seemingly got into bed with the checkoff. So this complex was actually financed by checkoff dollars. Their milk was actually financed by checkoff dollars. And keep in mind, this model of production is driving the family farm dairy into bankruptcy. So imagine the family dairy farmers are paying into a program that's undermining them. On top of it, the scary thing is these things called manure digesters. So when a cow when she defecates on land, she's fertilizing her feed. When you shove her indoors all day, first of all, you need fossil fuels to grow her feed. On top of it, she produces additional methane gas when you pull her manure. So this model production is actually worse for the climate. They know that. So they use checkoff dollars, essentially finance junk science to get a bunch of taxpayer money to solve their own problem of their creation. These manure digesters where you essentially pool the manure, you try to capture the methane gas. So keep in mind, family farmers do not have this issue. They're using their money to undermine them. I'm going to come back to this in a second. The scary thing about industrial dairy too is I view a lot of them as the closest thing we have to modern day feudal lords. Because a lot of times not only are they the employer, they tend to also be the landlord. Because no one wants to live near these. And a lot of workforce tend to be undocumented men. They tend to be the largest employers in the counties. They are, and like there was a This American Life episode a few years ago where it's not uncommon to see like 12 workers living in a 2-bedroom trailer. Going back to this is, there's just a story in Bloomberg how, Fairway's just been a runaway success for Coke. Coke bought Fairlife from my dairy barons a few years ago. And I don't know if anyone's from the Chicago area, Fairlife had a famous animal welfare scandal a few years ago. So that you saw some protests, but then look, the sales just keep going. And all the grocers that pulled it off their shelves in Chicago put it back on. And actually, last month in Phoenix, they had another animal welfare abuse scandal. But here's the thing. First of all, Mike helped write the regulations for the welfare stuff. So they're self-regulating, essentially. The other thing, too, is this is just what this production model does. Imagine doing dairy cows in Phoenix. It's 120 degree heat for the cow. It's 120 degree heat for the worker. You're young. You're not paid that much. Animals aren't happy. You're asking for abuse. And also, I discovered researching this chapter is my dairy barons claim residency at the Ritz-Carlton in Puerto Rico. My guess is if you claim residency in Puerto Rico, you don't pay capital income tax. So one could assume when they sold Fairlife to Coca-Cola, you avoid paying taxes. So keep in mind, this empire is built on so much government subsidy and how little they're giving back to government or to the entities that help build them. And finally, when I was researching this, I discovered, that photo I showed you of that fan going down, that metal shed? A worker died inside a manure digester just a few months before I visited. It reads like a horror film where he got sucked into that manure digester. He was a father of 3. It was never, and here's the thing to me that really startled me here is, first of all, there was only a $12,000 fine for this. And this was never reported in the local news. And this is one of the largest tourist attractions in the state of Indiana. I only uncovered it, and it wasn't like I went around with a magnifying glass or knocked on doors. I was just going through ocean records. It was in the records. It was in the OSHA files. It's just the public name is different than the legal name, and that's how I uncovered it. But it was right there. And I think, to me, this shows the state of so much rural news has been hollowed out. And even in agriculture, so much agriculture news we read is financed by checkoff money. That's why I think checkoffs are they control the ecosystem. So in Iowa, there's something called the Agribusiness Association of Iowa. They finance agriculture news at night. So that's like living in West Virginia and your business report at night's coming from the coal industry. That is where we are. And on top of it, as these papers have hollowed out, the New York Times only seems to care about what's the new $300 vegan restaurant. There's a disconnect in these spaces. So here's the other baron. I'm going to kind of speed through these last few. Driscoll's tends to shock people. Driscoll sells 1 in 3 berries, but they don't grow a single berry. They do the chicken thing. They contract out production. So Driscoll's thinks of itself like Apple. It owns the IP and has other people grow it. So that way other people can engage in this exploitative labor, environmental stuff, and Driscoll's can have the veil of ignorance. Oh, we didn't know. And I also use this chapter to talk about the offshoring or nearshoring of the American produce system. Is with these trade agreements is basically what this allows is a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards. So you're seeing a lot of produce move offshore. That's anything that requires labor. That's why a lot of California now is nuts, because that's capital intensive, not labor intensive. Here's the thing, keep in mind, so in sociology they call this a Southern model. But keep in mind, this undermines farmers here doing it right. If you're following the law, following the environmental standards, you can't compete on price against production models using child labor. And that's like a rampant thing in this production model. LA Times did a big series 10, 15 years ago just saying how you have children picking berries for children. Because who's going to go check? A lot of these berry production occurs in Baja, where they bring in indigenous workers. They're basically modern day plantations. Journalists put their lives at risk to go report this stuff. So there's so much we just don't know. And on top of it, Consumer Reports did a big study this past summer. What do even organics, when I see organic produce from another country, I just don't trust that label anymore. Because who's there to enforce those standards? And here's a good example too of that veil of ignorance is, so Driscoll's is headquartered near Santa Cruz in California. And the farm workers there asked them, so this is an elementary school here, you can literally see playgrounds and then you see berry productions. They asked Driscoll's, can you please just can you do organics next to our schools so our kids don't get exposed to the pesticides? Keep in mind, I say Driscoll sells 1 in 3 berries. Their market share in organics is actually even bigger. What does Driscoll, the brothers, do? Well, we can't do anything. Our growers, can do whatever they want. And it's just like, it allows them to evade responsibility for the actions of their production model. JBS Foods is my slaughtering baron. As I said earlier, they're number 1 in beef, number poultry, number 2 in pork, number 1 in leather. This is a good example of illusion of choice. Keep in mind, they didn't sell any meat in America until the George Bush administration. Now they own all these brands. Here's slide 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This next one got me. So there's a place in DC called Old Ebbitt Grill. It's like a fancy Applebee's. And I remember, like on menus that say our supplier is blank blank to give you that illusion or play into that notion of the goodwill you have towards a family farm. They kept saying on their menu, and it's actually to this day when I looked 2 months ago, our beef is from Cedar River Farms. I'm from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, so I was like, oh, I've never heard of this farm. Let me buy some local beef. I go home and Google it. Guess what? It's fake. It's from Grinnell, Colorado. They're playing into that illusion you have of that local farmer. On the East Coast, too, they're building all these little local meat stores. Here's the thing. I know they're fake because no local meat store ever looks that good. But it's all about exploiting that imagery of do good, but their dominance in that space. Just to make this chapter short and sweet, a lot of my anger when I read this chapter is I'm not even mad at them. I just think they're a child that's never been punished, so they keep pushing the envelope. Is my anger in this chapter lies with Secretary Vilsack. We know what to do here. We're talking, we dealt with the meat industry a century ago. We're not talking AI, we're talking hogs. Instead of doing anything meaningful, he took $1 billion and threw it at new startups, new slaughterhouses. First of all, we've never deconcentrated an industry by financing new market entrants. So what's happening now, on top of it, all these meat companies made major acquisitions these last 4 years. So it's just, it's a good example of I actually think this type of behavior is actually more destructive for democracy because you're telling people, you're giving people a false sense of hope as systems get worse. Into my hog chapter, actually, in 2002, Vilsack was governor of Iowa running for re-election. He was running against the head lobbyist for my hog baron, and he ran ads saying, I'm going to do something about these hog confinements, tapping into the activists, the anger people felt. And the way Iowa works is only the governor of Iowa can stop the construction of these confinements. After he won, not only did he not do anything, he oversaw the largest expansion of confinements in Iowa history. That destroys people's hope. I view a lot of these rural communities as almost having Stockholm Syndrome. They fought power and they lost, and they can no longer afford to live where their kids live because your home values collapse in these production environments. I mean, I'll stop. Last thing with Walmart, as I mentioned earlier, Walmart's a dominant grocery provider, the world's richest family. They own these 2 NFL teams. Fun little fact for the actual idea for Walmart Supercenter is actually a French idea. It comes from Carrefour. Sam Walton was on vacation, saw that, and was like, oh, I'm going to bring that here. So the original Walmart was called Hypermarket USA. They built one in Dallas, Wichita, and I forget somewhere else, but they realized these things were massive. Employees used to roller skate in them. They were so big. Parking was a disaster, and they realized it was too much walking for Americans. So the average Walmart Supercenter we know today is a small town version of this concept. But basically, Sam Walton realized his whole goal is to own every dollar of your paycheck. So if you go in any Walmart now, you'll see, I'm going to go to this slide. You'll see basically banks inside Walmart, they're trying out healthcare clinics, they're trying out vet clinics. Their goal is to capture every dollar. Real quick, just to show you their power, I love this. When you do your research, go to the local papers and the trade news outlets, you get the best nuggets. And this is a really good example of it. Walmart has a rule for suppliers, no more than 30% of your sales can come from Walmart, which I didn't understand. So I had to ask people in the grocery industry, and what they told me is this is a supply chain risk management strategy. Walmart knows it's such a vulture that you basically sell to them at loss or cost. But if you go more than 30%, you put yourself at risk of bankruptcy. So it wants you on life support, but it doesn't want to kill you. And what's really scary now is Walmart's actually making vertical plays into beef and dairy. Because people tend to judge your grocery store based on how good the beef and dairy is, and Walmart's being so sick of being gouged by the beef industry. So it's building its own beef slaughterhouses now in Wichita. And we shouldn't rely on Walmart to save us, but that is where we are right now. Also, this whole chapter 2 is on SNAP. So much of Walmart's clientele and employees rely on food assistance, which is basically, SNAP has become a low-wage subsidy. You can work full-time and still need it. It's become a low-wage subsidy. It's the largest employer in this country and the world's richest family. But here's the thing. The whole point of my book is I view this book as almost, this is what neoliberalism did to the food system. But you have to understand how you got to a point and understand the corners cut in order to fix it. So my big thing right now is I want to put animals back on the land. My silver lining is ethanol is going to die. More than 50%, the largest use of corn now in America is ethanol. And Bloomberg just reported that Norway, first time ever, first country to have 100% of their car sales this past year be EVs. Cars are moving to hybrids and EVs. What are we going to do with the corn crop? Imagine if even we just use half the ethanol. What are you going to do with that? That's millions of acres of corn. My goal is to put animals on the land. It's better for rural communities. It's a better tasting product. Because guess what? Most grain production in the future will be robotics. That's not a bad thing. There's only so many cows on pasture one person can look after. Second is, this is fun, is like knowing that the goal of any corporate executive is monopoly, how do you put up potential barriers to stop vertical and horizontal integration? So one example is like Iowa has a law in the books, we don't enforce it, called the Packer ban, where it says you cannot own the animal you slaughter. If you would actually enforce that rule, basically it's a hard line between these two. You'd break up most of the meat companies in America because they own a lot of them own a large amount of animals. So how do you think that way? How do you purposely put up roadblocks? Or another thing too is you ban mergers after a certain threshold. Once you're so big, you can't buy another company. I mean, this is the nerd in me. Markets are constructs. How do you want to construct these markets? A good example is actually alcohol. If you have time, Ken Burns has a really good documentary called Prohibition, where companies basically used to sell alcohol at a loss to get you drunk and sell you other things. So when we legalized alcohol, we intentionally constructed these markets to diffuse power. So if you make alcohol, distribute it, and you sell it, are 3 different markets. And that was by design, because we want to stop this consolidation of power. So how do we design these markets in such a way too? 3, I talked about this earlier, institutional buyers. As we phase out this old system, we got to help build up the new one. And the best thing you can do is schools buy a lot of food. How do we get these how do we get these big buyers to buy a lot of local food to help stabilize and grow these businesses? Another good example, I've been talking a lot about, is this tribal elder box program in Wisconsin, Minnesota, where historically we used to just dump surplus food on Native American tribes. Now there's a new program where you're essentially buying from Native farmers to get food to Native people. What a great concept. Number 4 is rethinking the Farm Bill. I don't like picking favorites. I'd rather subsidize farm practices. So I'd rather take these 3 programs, put them in the one, and let farmers decide what's best for their land. Do they want cover crops, buffer strips, what have you? I love this quote right here, going back to my Eleanor Roosevelt quote, kick right now. This is from her. The farmers are engaged in probably the most exciting gamble that there is in a business venture. Is bringing back the fun of this. Let them have a robust operation, let them decide what's best. But I do not like this system right now where we subsidize some crops but not others. And the other one is thinking about national sovereignty in the food system. I'm pulling this from the FCC, where historically, like if you owned a newspaper in America or a TV station, you had to be American. And I personally believe in the food system that should apply to each country, just because it's food and news information. And the meat industry is really interesting too, is not only are these a lot of foreign meat packers, it's really interesting from like an economic development standpoint is a lot of them are state-backed monopolies. Like for example, with WH Group of Shanghai, pork is such an important protein to the Chinese diet, but there's been a lot of articles in Reveal talking about how there's been a lot of unfair state subsidies going into that company because that protein is so important. But that's not fair to American businesses when you're not competing on a fair price against a state-backed monopoly. Number 6, I used to say strip USDA for parts, but given the current state of America right now, I wouldn't use that language. I think we should rethink USDA. One example I focus in on a lot is that Commissioner Lena Khan I mentioned earlier. She does antitrust for every market, most markets in America except meatpacking. USDA has a carve out. I would take that carve out away from USDA because it's shown it can't do its job and give it back to the Federal Trade Commission. So I'm all about how, even something like, should forest services be under USDA or should it be an interior? Should SNAP be on USDA or should it be under HHS? I think we should have honest conversations over where should things be. I just feel like at this point, USDA only serves the interests of big ag and no one else. The other thing too to keep in mind is journalists. For the community members in the room, journalists are your friends. Especially in this day and age, see something, say something. Journalists make very little and they're moving a mile a minute. How can you help them out? And I love this little example where that banker I was telling you about in Western Iowa, she told me Iowa has a program, and it's a cool program where to help control the deer population, we pay hunters to hunt deer, and then we pay local meat lockers to process that meat, and then we give it out for free at food pantries. Great program. Here's the thing she was telling me. No one's checking for the lead bullets in the meat. So we could be giving out lead-tainted meat at these food pantries. So I let this journalist know. She just published a story where only the state of Minnesota checks the meat for lead. That's one little conversation over dinner in Iowa. I sent an email to a journalist. She spent 6 months on this. Now we know. Now these conversations can occur. That's the power you have. And this is a more graphic example, but I love this one. You know the movie Fargo, the mulch scene at the end? A confinement owner was doing that in Iowa. Taking their dead hogs and throwing them into a mulcher and throwing the parts onto a field. That's illegal. Older woman in Iowa saw that, tried to report it. The state didn't do anything, so you know what she did? She told a local TV news crew in Omaha. They did a local story on it. Guess what? It blew up. People got mad. The state finally did something. That's the power you have, is to tell these stories. And number 8 is never forget when you elect a governor or a president, you're electing tons of appointees. Who's in these positions of power matters. The appointment of Lena Khan changed that antitrust ecosystem. So there's a whole book literally called the Plum Book that details all the political appointees. Number 9 is I really encourage you guys to research and write about this stuff. That's the fun part here. Is we know the system's broken. What should it be? What should these systems be? I love that. Here's a little example. USDA asked me a few years ago on scholarship on grocery stores. And there's not that much scholarship. And here's the thing. We all grocery shop. So I organized a conference on grocery monopoly issues in the grocery store, which, by the way, everything you see on the shelf has been paid for. That's a whole, you gotta think of a grocery store now as a mall without walls. Like Walmart bought, Viso, that TV company. Walmart bought a flat screen TV company because it's trying to buy TV ads. So if you buy ads on Walmart TV, you're gonna get a good placement on Walmart shelf. It's a whole shenanigan game. Anyways, the student wrote a paper on why in New Haven is there only one grocery store and it's awful. That was literally her question, is why do I have awful grocery store options? She wrote a paper that ended up being published later on about there's all this stuff landlords do, or like grocery stores put in their contracts to keep other companies out. This anti-competitive behavior. And finally, this is for the community members in the room. I always tell people, you gotta join an organization. You can't do this alone. My book opens with Julie Dunn. Julie Dunn is right there in the middle. She's a retired secretary in Eldora, Iowa, and she spent her retirement fighting these confinements in Iowa. That's my favorite little dirty secret of the Midwest. It's usually pissed off old ladies who are fighting these industrial facilities, because she's like, I don't want my grandchild to grow up in this. She knows what the system used to be, and she tells me this all the time. You can't do this alone, but she's fighting this for her grandchild. So on that note, and I should say too, a few more things. I'm working on Cisco as my next Baron, so keep an eye out for that. They sell 50% market share in restaurants. Honestly, my question for this whole chapter is, why do most diners taste like meh anymore? And then I'm also thinking about a second book on food markets that work. So I'm looking at maple syrup, New Mexico green chili, Irish butter, just kind of almost like a pro-regulation book without ever saying those words. And then finally, never forget the system we have now in America is actually radical. It is radical that one man does 5 million hogs. It's radical that the world's richest family has that market share in grocery. So much of what we're talking about is actually very traditional. And I also want to center this conversation on labor, because once you start talking about labor, you're talking about 1 in 10 of Americans. You're talking people like my mom and dad. My dad was a truck driver, my mom ran a bakery. I just want to focus on that, because I just feel like right now people crave hope and what the system could be. And on that note, also, this makes a great gift to your parents. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions from you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Austin. That was amazing. Yeah, just mind-blowing, all of this information. And we do have some questions on the Zoom. If there are questions in the room, you can raise your hand, and then I'll come to you with the mic so our 150 viewers on Zoom can hear you. So the first question is from Lily. And she's wondering, have any of the barons targeted you since the publication of your book?
You know, we talked about this over at lunch today. I was very fortunate where everyone had, you know that first book you read as a kid, the first like nonfiction adult book? My first one was Fast Food Nation. And I actually read it working at a fast food joint. So Eric, the guy who wrote it, wrote my foreword. And he sat down and gave me the talk. He's like, this is what to expect. It used to be they would attack you in the media. Now they don't. They tend to attack you behind the scenes. You know, going to your employer, doing all these shenanigans. I knew that having that really helped me, like having that mentorship. Like I think just in general, having a mentor in a career is huge. Just so when you have, like I had panicky moments writing this book, and to call someone who's been through it being like, no. But that's why there's 1,000 footnotes in my book. And that's because it's like, the liability is now on me. And I also wanted to show people, this might seem crazy, but there's a little footnote. You know what I mean? There's a little piece of evidence. I did have my hog baron attack me, where they wrote an op-ed in Des Moines Register saying, oh, they're good stewardships for the land. But here's the thing. I actually, and it was right before, my last book talk was in their hometown. That's where that photo was taken. I got 50 people in a town of 5,000 people and I would come to a book talk, which you're lucky in New York City to get that many people. And it was the one time I was afraid where I turned on the tracking thing on my phone, because I told my husband jokingly if I show up in a manure pit the next day. But here's the thing. I didn't get one bad, like, everyone there saw the empire being built and they saw the lies. And half the people afterwards stayed behind just to tell me little examples. I don't know, I'm also of the opinion, I think part of my logic in writing this book is they win when the status quo holds. How do I put on a show? How do I get you to care? And like part of the robber baron framework is I want to, first of all, it makes them cartoonish. It's kind of like this, you guys probably don't know the movie The Producers by Mel Gibson. His whole notion, it was a movie making fun of Hitler. And his whole thing is by making them into clowns, you take away their power. So by making them cartoonish, I want to show you that you can overcome them, but also show you, like rooted in history, where we've dealt with this before. Like, you know, we've been in this Gilded Age, we've been in an era of robber barons, and by highlighting the cartoonishness, that's how I'm trying to do the empowerment. But it's also, I don't know, I'm a big believer, if not now, then when, especially given the moment we're living in.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely noticed some of the cartoonishness coming out, especially with the Fair Oaks Farm theme park for dairy confinement is pretty wild. Are there questions in the room? I'll give a moment if anyone wants to raise their hand if you have a question. Okay, I see one in the back here. Hi, Emily.
Hi, so I'm not from Iowa, but I lived in Iowa for a long time because I went to the University of Iowa for my undergrad. So a lot of the stuff I ran into, like as an environmentalist working in Iowa, is how do you break through the image of farmers? Because I feel like there's like a miscommunication between what farmers do and, you know, I mean, you're from Iowa, you know how much it's advertised, like America needs farmers, it's everywhere. I mean, Iowa State is like a huge agricultural school. So like, how do you communicate the kind of falsehood of farming and feeding America with the actual reality of everything without dissing farmers and making it sound like you're trying to diss their work?
That's a great question, and that's something I was very conscious of you can only deconstruct so many narratives. I didn't deconstruct that narrative. But I realized in most rural communities in America, the richest family tends to be the farm family. They're the ones where the child drives an $80,000 Dodge truck. What I realized though, writing this chapter, first of all, so much of this, when I tell you about Driscoll's, you can only do that so much, blow people's minds. But what I realized is even those farmers don't realize they're just pawns in a bigger game. Like the dirty secret in Iowa, and I'll never forget this conversation, was a Farm Bureau vice president told me the future of Iowa is 6 towns, a bunch of driverless tractors. He's not wrong. You go to any farm show now, these combines are basically driverless. They cost $600,000. And every time corn bumps up in price, they demolish all these old homes. They don't realize that their clock's even ticking. And I'm glad you said the America needs farmers, but anytime you see University of Iowa football, that thing used to drive me nuts because it's all Farm Bureau. And this is where, again, rabbit holes. The Iowa Farm Bureau is the largest agricultural organization in America. It's a $120 million a year nonprofit. What organization gets massive as your base collapses. It's an insurance company. Insurance is regulated by the states, and unbeknownst to most people, the largest industry in Iowa is actually insurance, Des Moines. And so like Iowa is to insurance what what Delaware is to corporations. That's like my little pet peeve, but I didn't want to write a chapter ranting about Farm Bureau. But I think the cancer stuff is really what's going to break. That's what's going to be the big breaking point in Iowa is Iowa's an old state, and the cancer, every year we see it, it gets worse and worse. It's the only state with an increasing cancer rate. And it's just, I mean, you're seeing right now a massive thing play out in power where some Roundup is actually made in Muscatine, Iowa. They're having all these lawsuits, the cancer lawsuits. So they're trying to push through this legislation, essentially strip away those rights. And they can't even do that in Iowa where they control everything. So who knows? I mean, but I'm glad you asked that question because like, you got to pick your narrative battles. And like, that was just a narrative battle I decided not to have because I realized like, part of like what I like about public speaking is like I was mentioning to someone earlier is this is like stand-up comedy for me. I'm trying rhetoric and I realize most people have this notion of Iowa's Field of Dreams. And the Field of Dreams died in Iowa, but I can't deconstruct that narrative. I mean, like that's almost the narrative power I have being an Iowan. Like it's not right that I'm a tall guy from Iowa, but I have a lot of narrative. Like I always say I'm 7th generation Iowan because for some weird reason, because I have that background, it gives me narrative power. But Iowa is to agriculture what Hollywood is to films and the American imagination. Just like honestly, Detroit is to cars. You know what I mean? Like there are just certain narratives that people have ingrained in them.
Thank you. Was there a question over here? Okay.
You talked about the Federal Trade Commission and the commissioner did you say that she's still there now?
No, she just left.
Okay. I was wondering, I guess I want you to just talk a little bit more about, you mentioned very briefly about how some of these issues are bipartisan and that you can, I think, see common ground across the aisle. What kind of hope at all do you see with this current administration as possibly moving forward some of the things that you're considering, or is it just going to undermine everything even more?
So I start with hope is I always view DC as the last person to know. Fun fact, most New Deal legislation came out in New York State and Wisconsin. And so what I want to focus on right now is like proof of concepts. Like that's why I love that Tribal Elders Box program. Focus on what you can do locally, but show it works, study it, create all that literature. Like here's an Iowa City example. Iowa City made the buses free. Turns out bus use goes way up. Do these little things so other cities can make it bigger. So if you do have a moment of reform, you know what to do. You have a plan, you have proof of concepts. To the Federal Trade Commission thing is, what's interesting is you don't just change legal discourse overnight, but she started that shift where the new person comes in and basically takes her framework. She comes out with the new merger guidelines, like what gets approved, what not in America for mergers, accepts it, which I didn't think he would do. And not only the Trump DOJ announced they're going to continue the Google trial, their motives might be different, but you're also seeing too now in the law school, a lot of the literature now in the law school is reflecting her framework. And keep in mind, I don't know if Lena's 36. I'm not joking, where she's like a living historical figure where I could see her being appointed again, or I can see her be a Supreme Court judge one day. Like you don't know, like Louis Brandeis was just a business lawyer who saw a train monopoly being formed in New England, started fighting it, and then President Wilson, I believe, appointed him to the Supreme Court. So who knows? I mean, you can't, but for hope right now, I really focus on the local. And that's actually what's so cool about what's going on, like this class, this thing you guys put together is there's actually a lot of cool stuff going on in Michigan. What I've learned, I'm a big believer that you have to see America to understand America. There's all these different regional production systems. Like, I didn't know you guys did so much fruit. And then Detroit has a lot of cool things. But people, when they do these things, they're running uphill. And so how do you realize what barriers are hitting? How do you document them? And also, how do you brag about them? Because what I've noticed, a lot of people doing the good thing, they don't really know how to sell themselves. So how do you show that? So that's kind of where I'd rather just play my own game right now. Like that's where my head is at. Is like, what food system do I want? Because like, to Julie Dunn's point, we didn't get here overnight and we're not going to get there overnight. But like, how do we start laying out a vision of a system that gets us to a point 30, 40 years from now? that's like, because this current system is going to break. You can't be doing industrial, like New Mexico does, I think, 3 times more dairy than Vermont. That makes no sense. Those aquifers are collapsing. Something's going to have to give. And what happened with the bird flu right now is just like, that is a new norm for this production model. It's not going to go away.
So seeing that you have like a lot of experience with research and like information when it comes to these barons, like such as the dairy farms and like the meat factories, whatever, what kind of information or what do you know regarding the use of antibiotics in animals, and like how does that affect us, or like how does that affect?
Great question. That is, I have a little bit of it I mentioned in my hog chapter. That is, how do I say this? There's so many, I'm just gonna be blunt, so many things in the food system you see are just dumb. You're taking this beautiful technology advancement and you're just wrecking it. And here's why. They're doing it because, first of all, these animals can't really live this close together without pumping them full of drugs, but also a lot of it's for weight gain. Why? Just so a pig gets fat. Like, it's just, again, keep in mind for pork. Our pork consumption in America is flat. We're producing more pork for export, mainly from Mexico and China. Is it worth it? Is it worth destroying antibiotics for export? I was careful not to touch the science stuff because that is not my expertise. And that tends to be where a lot of the lawsuits, especially when you start talking I'm talking more glyphosate, that kind of stuff. But the antibiotic stuff, you just see and you're just, even like the ethanol stuff, I felt, quote, brave by saying ethanol was dumb. Why is that brave? It's so obviously not good for, like, you know what I mean? Like, you just look at the science, you're like, at best, it's a wash. Why is that brave? But that's like, it also shows you the power of these industries where they're really good at making examples of people. Like Monsanto did that famously with the Roundup. It would sue the crap out of a farmer, and then people start talking. One could argue you're seeing that playing out in politics right now. You make an example of someone to scare the herd.
All right, I'm gonna ask the last question just for the sake of time. So someone was curious about the tribal elder food box program that you mentioned earlier, and I'm wondering if we could end on like a high note of maybe that program or something else that you're really excited about in terms of changing the food system in a new way.
Yeah, well, I love that program. As I was mentioning to Shiloh earlier, I heard about that at Wisconsin Dells Water Park. That's why I'm a big believer. You just get out and talk to people. Like the beauty of, I mean, keep in mind, what I realized writing this book is I have a very Iowa Midwest view of food. California is way different. Like California never had family farms. California is rooted in colonial agriculture because that's the way land was distributed. So just talking to different people, you realize every commodity, every production system is different. And that's why I love doing these things is you just start talking to people, you build relationships. And it was at the Wisconsin Water Park Hotel, Chula Vista for the Wisconsin people out there, where my friend Sarah Lloyd, we were just talking. And I told her, well, I'm thinking this. She's like, well, let me tell you about this program up in northern Wisconsin. So I just made note of it. And then, I jokingly call this in my computer my purgatory folder, where I just throw ideas into it. And I threw that, and and I just realized probably in the last few months talking to people that's why don't do Zooms, do things in person. Always do class in person, because you can read body language so much more. And I could just tell by reading body language is people are just dark right now. They have a nihilism. And one of my favorite movies in recent time is that film, Everything Everywhere All at Once. And what I love about that movie is, even if you're nihilistic, just be nice. Focus on the hope. And that's what I realized, like, that Wisconsin thing taught me is like, oh, there's still good people out there doing good things. I could write another dark book, or I'd rather spend my time focusing on what the system could be. Because what I realized is people keep asking me, what should it be? And I don't really have a lot of things to point to. Because a lot of the agriculture stuff is not comparative. And so it's also just fun. It's fun to think. It's fun to sit there and think like, oh yeah, what should this be? And like, you also just see, I don't know, you guys. I went to that famous Ann Arbor place yesterday for the first time, Zingerman's or. Yeah,
Zingerman's, yeah.
Yeah, and you're just like, oh God, that's so much better than Panera. But that's a lot of work, and I just really encourage you all to think that way now. Is the hope, and talk to people. Build up these relationships, get in front of people, don't do the Zoom thing. It's these one-on-one things where because you're not going to find that in Google. What am I going to type into Google to hear about the Tribalder's box program? It's these relationships. Relationships are everything. And that is something you just need to do one-on-one and talking to people and honestly putting the rhetoric out there. I mean, that's the hardest part for me to write a book is I can't go back in and tweak it. I mean, I want to change language, I want to do, but you can't. But so thank you guys so much for coming here today. I know we're running out of time. Is there anything else?
Yeah, no, thank you. I just have some final announcements, but thank you so much, Austin. If we can do another round of applause for you.
And I'm happy to stay after too to answer any questions too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, I just have a few quick announcements. I just wanted to share some events coming up that seem really exciting and also connect to some of what you were talking about. You mentioned big tech. So these are some cool events. They're happening March 21st, April 4th, and April 18th. Some adding art to food and thinking about seeds. It's really exciting. And I also want to share that Fast Food for Thought will be happening on Tuesday, April 15th. This will be at 6:30 to 8, and we have a really wonderful lineup of speakers across the U of M, different staff, professors, there's a PhD student. We have a variety of different schools represented, and they'll all be talking just 5-minute flash talks. So if your attention span is getting lower towards the end of the semester, this will be really exciting. It'll just be 5-minute flash talks on their research or work that they're doing around food and agriculture. All right, and that's April 15th. And then lastly, I just wanted to share the speaker for next week. This is March 25th. It will be back on Zoom. And this is Jason Maurice Porter. They are an environmental writer and historian who serves as a presidential postdoctoral fellow in the history department and a Black and Indigenous climate faculty fellow in the Harriet Tubman department at the University of Maryland. And he specializes in Black and Indigenous environmental histories. He'll be sharing a talk on researching, writing, and teaching Black environmental histories and ecologies of diaspora. So that'll be next week on Zoom. Yeah, thank you so much for coming and have a great evening. Thank you.
Good job.